Welcome and thank you very much for being here. As the title suggests, the central topic of my presentation is going to be the difficulty of language awareness task in the INVALSI tests. So I'm going to focus on the language awareness section of Italian tests. As you probably know, they are composed of two main sections. There is a reading comprehension section and a section dedicated to language awareness. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the language awareness section. And I'm going to focus on the factors that influence the difficulty of these questions, because knowing what makes these tasks more or less difficult is fundamental for the formulation of language awareness tasks, as well as for the description of competence levels on the basis of these tasks. As you probably know, in the last 2 years, starting from 2018, the test results have been returned to the schools in terms of competence levels, described on the basis of a qualitative analysis of the task students have to deal with in our tests. An agenda of my presentation to give you an idea about what am I going to talk about. First, I will start with the definition of the main theoretical concepts I work with, such as language awareness, explicit and implicit competence. And then I will introduce some theoretical considerations about the factors that influence the difficulty of language awareness tasks in our test. These are going to be theoretical considerations I did use from several books, empirical and theoretical research on language awareness. But another aspect I'm really interested in are the students behind the theory, and this is the reason why I've been conducting qualitative studies over the last 2 years. So I'm going to present some qualitative data in order to examine to what extent are these factors observable in students' reflections on language awareness tasks. So these are going to be the 3 main topics I will cover in my presentation. Language awareness can be defined as explicit knowledge about language and conscious perception and sensitivity in language learning and language use. This is a definition given by the Association for Language Awareness. And language awareness has 2 main components: implicit competence, which is a procedural competence, so it allows speakers to use language automatically without even thinking about it. It is acquired accidentally and it cannot be directly observed. It is inferred from the speaker's systematic behavior, while explicit knowledge about language is a declarative knowledge. It is acquired through explicit instruction, so it is teachable and observable. The language awareness questions in the INVALSI tests require the exploitation of both implicit competence and explicit knowledge about language. So students need to use their implicit linguistic competence as well as their explicit knowledge about language in order to answer our questions. And among the factors that influence the difficulty of these questions are the degree of explicitness of the analysis they require, the prototypicality of linguistic elements they focus on, and the complexity of form-meaning relationships displayed by these linguistic elements. I'm going to give you some examples in order to make it clear what am I talking about. So let's have a look at level 1 questions. These are the easiest questions in our test. They normally require a low degree of explicitness of analysis. So in order to answer these questions, students can rely on their implicit linguistic competence prevalently. And form-meaning relationships are usually not really complex in these questions. An example would be the question you can see here. If you are a speaker of Italian, probably most of you, then you can see that it focuses on the use of indefinite and definite article. And students can answer this question on the basis of their linguistic sensitivity. There are communicative situations described in the STEM, and students have to select between two sentences, the one they would use in that given situation, and the only difference in the two sentences between the two sentences is the use of definite and indefinite article. To make a sharp contrast, now I will show you a level 5 question, so one of the hardest questions the students had to deal with in the last years. Level 5 questions normally require a really explicit analysis, so there is a high level of explicitness. They focus on non-prototypical linguistic elements, and these linguistic elements often display really complex form-meaning relationships. An example for this kind of question would be the passive and active voice, so a question focusing on the distinction between passive and active voice. If you have a look at the sentences students have to analyze, you can see that there are some very tricky sentences among them. For instance, the sentence C, questi moduli vanno spediti entro la fine del mese. The agent is not made explicit in this case, and the passive is formulated with the verb andare, which is also a lexical verb in Italian, so it is formally complex. And in order to analyze these sentences, students need to develop an abstract representation of the sentence, and they need to distinguish between thematic roles such as agent and experiencer. They need to distinguish between syntactic roles such as subject and direct object. They need to take into account the concept of transitivity. So from a theoretical point of view, we can give a lot of reasons why this question is difficult for the students, because they have to deal with a lot of variables which make reference to different levels of linguistic analysis, the level of meaning and semantics, as well as the level of morphosyntax. What I'm really interested in are the students behind these theoretical considerations. So the question I keep asking myself, to what extent are these factors of difficulty observable in students' linguistic reflections? And therefore I've been conducting qualitative studies over the last 2 years in order to find qualitative evidence for difficulty factors identified on the basis of test results and theoretical considerations. I kept interviewing students. I collected 518 minutes of interviews in third class of lower secondary schools and the second class of upper secondary schools. And in some cases, since I didn't want to influence what the students were saying, I asked them to work on their own. And in those cases, they had to make a tutorial video on some of our linguistic tasks. So I collected 65 minutes of tutorial videos as well. These data have been analyzed by using qualitative content analysis, which is a cyclical process. It starts with the collection of qualitative data, and then I carried out a deductive coding, so I applied categories developed on a theoretical basis to my data, but I often realized that those categories did not cover the globality of my data, so I needed to carry out an inductive coding as well. I formulated categories generated from the data, and then I often realized that I needed to collect more data and carry out another deductive coding and so on. So it's an extremely time-consuming process, and the considerations, the results I'm going to present today are based on approximately the 40% of my data. The main aspects that are challenging for the students on the basis of my data are the following. They find it quite challenging to switch back and forth between different levels of linguistic analysis, such as the level of semantics and the level of morphosyntax. And it is often challenging for the students to select the linguistic features which are relevant for the analysis required by the task. I'm going to show you some examples which are based on students' reflections on the passive voice. For instance, let's have a look at the sentence, I miei genitori vanno spesso alla fiera del libro. In English it would be something like, my parents often go to the book exhibition. In this case, we have a syntactic subject in the role of agent, and it is a human subject. So this is quite an easy sentence for the students. They very often give answers like this. This sentence is active because there is a subject who completes the action. So they focus on semantics, and they often say if the syntactic subject is a human and it is in the role, it has the thematic role of agent, then the sentence has to be active, which is not a wrong idea, it is appropriate, but a very, very firm conviction of this type might be misleading in some situations. For instance, if we take a look at the sentence, mio fratello è convocato spesso per le partite in trasferta. Now, this sentence means my brother is often invited to participate in away games. Sorry. And in this case, the students often say that it is an active sentence. And they motivate their answer by saying that it is him who is being invited. So, the conclusion they make that if the syntactic subject is human, then the sentence has to be active. I very often ask students to manipulate linguistic data. So, for instance, in this case, I would ask them, how could you transform it into the passive voice? And then they often just invert the sentence constituents and say, le partite di trasferta convocano mio fratello, sarebbe la passiva. So, the passive voice would be, the away games invite my brother. Because they are likely to think that if the syntactic subject is not human, then the sentence has to be passive. Another pattern emerging from the data is that they have a simplistic representation of active and passive voice, so they imagine a sentence like this. There has to be a verb in the middle, there has to be somewhere before the verb and behind the verb, and if I would like to transform the sentence from the active voice into the passive voice or vice versa, then I have to invert these two parts of the sentence. They are very unlikely to refer to the concept of transitivity. It is really, really rare in my data. Out of 20 students I interviewed about this question, only 3 students referred to the concept of transitivity. And if we take a look at this last example, questi moduli vanno spediti entro la fine del mese, these documents have to be sent before the end of the month, we see again this simplistic representation of the sentence structure, because in this case students say that it is a passive sentence, so I asked them to transform it into the active voice, and their answer is entro la fine del mese vanno spediti questi moduli. So again they just invert the two parts of the sentence and say before the end of the month these documents have to be sent. So the interviews I've been conducting with the students open up a more fine-grained understanding of the factors that influence the difficulty of language awareness task, which are the selection of linguistic features relevant for the analysis. As we have seen, for instance, they are not able to focus, or just a few students are able to focus on the concept of transitivity. They keep focusing on the level of semantics and meanings, and it is challenging for the students to focus on morphosyntax. And another challenge is to develop an abstract representation of linguistic structures. They do not really have an abstract representation of syntactic roles and thematic roles. They have a quite simplistic representation of sentence structures. So these are the main challenges that emerged from my interviews so far. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.